Rivers State has again maintained its overall fiscal performance position, ranking first just like it did in 2020 and 2021 among the 36 states in Nigeria. This was as Kaduna and Cross River State made it to top 5 on overall fiscal performance ranking in the country, while Yobe State dropped from bottom 5, having fallen 13 places from 21st in 2021 to 34th position in 2022. Now, BudgIT, a foremost civic tech organization leading the advocacy for fiscal transparency and accountability in Nigeria, made this disclosure in its 2022 edition of its annual State of State report titled Sustainable Governance Reforms for a New Era. But in a swift reaction, where some states, Ogun and Bayelsa states, have widely publicized the report, Bayelsa State described the ratings as not only faulty, but everybody has their comments on this. But let's do an assessment of this document. That's why we are here. And we have somebody from BudgIT. He's Mr. Iniobong Usen. He is the head research and policy advisory at BudgIT. He's live in the studio. Thank you so much. It's good to have you talk to us around this report.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good afternoon.
Yes, a lot of work here, really. I must say, I must give it to BudgIT. A lot of things around transparency and what you've been pushing for, fiscal sustainability. I think that is it. Let's start with, what are really the key highlights of this year's state-to-state report?
Yeah, thanks, Tolu. So returning to normalcy and looking at an increase in economic activities in 2021 from 2020, the COVID year, states were able to sort of grow their revenue by 9%. And if you look at the revenue breakdown, you would see that the IGR component of the revenues for the 36 states cumulatively grew by over 30%. Now, that's significant because it sort of signals the domestic resource mobilization capacity of the states. And it sort of tells us that states are beginning to see the need to wean themselves off federal transfers. But be that as it may, you still have about 33 states that still depend on at least 50% of the FAC revenues. That's your statutory allocation, your value-added tax, and for the oil-producing states, your 13% derivation as part of their revenue. And 13 states depend on at least 70% of federal transfers for their total revenue. Now, if you situate that within the fact that we're in a revenue crisis for the first or virtually all the months of this year, the NMPC has not remitted a dime to the Federation account. Yeah. And so that tells you that there's a shrinking fiscal space. On the expenditure side, total expenditure also grew as a lot of states needed to make more investments to be able to pull themselves out of the economic doldrums as a result of the COVID pandemic. But if you also look at components of expenditure for overheads, about 11 states grew their overheads by over 40%. Now, if we're having the conversations around why states need to reduce the cost of governance. So if we're faced with a revenue crisis and you still have states increasing their overheads by over 40%, about 11 of those states, then, it begs the question as to whether states are adjusting to the new fiscal realities. Personnel costs also grew marginally by over 5%. And CapEx, I'm always glad when states decide to prioritize CapEx. However, the quality of expenditure is still, it's still something that we need to do further research on. But for CapEx, cumulatively, the 36 states grew their capital expenditure, which is expenditure on human capital development infrastructure, by over 50%. But if you look at, for critical social sectors, key components like health spending per capita, for instance, about 24 states spends below the subnational average. For education spending per capita as well, 22 states spends below the subnational average. So that tells you that in terms of how states prioritize expenditure in critical social sectors that affect the common man, health, education, WASH, that sort of signals access to better education, access to better healthcare. The states are not doing as much as we would desire. If you compare expenditure on these critical sectors and expenditure on government, things like, for some states that are buoyant for the maintenance of aircraft, for travels and all of that, you still see that expenditure is still heavy on that side. If you come to debt, states, also grew debt marginally by also about 8%, about 6.3 trillion. So on the expenditure side, we see that although some progress has been made with capex, but for things like overheads, right, states need to really check to see that they reduce the cost of governance and ensure that what they are also spending on capex is heavy on critical social sectors, health, education, WASH, because there's a direct correlation between your spending on health, improved productivity, and economic growth. So we need to be able to draw that tangential to ensure that states grow economically and the development trajectories of the states are somewhat better.
Indeed, I'm talking to a research man, a research and policy man. Thank you so much for that clarity. But I would like to ask, just like others would want to know, that how did we arrive at the methodology for this ranking? I know some states would have come up and said, no, we don't agree with this. True?
I mean, we consulted the states, but I mean, we'll get to that.
Okay.
But if we would focus on the methodology, we use a composite index made up of 5 indexes. For the first index, Index A, we try to see how states are able to meet their operating expenses with their internally generated revenue. So are states able to pay salaries? Are they able to meet up with their public debt charges? Are they able to meet up with their overheads, with what they're able to generate internally? For the second index, Index A1, we try to look at the IGR growth. So year on year, we try to see have states been able to grow their IGR by a considerable percentage. For the Index B, we try to see how states are able to use their total revenue. Now, your total revenue is made up of your FAC, what comes from the federal government in terms of statutory allocation, VAT, and for all producing states, 13%. What you're able to generate internally, your IGR, and what we have as aids and grants. Now, I know some states made the argument when we consulted with the states that loans should be considered as part of revenue. But I do not think that loans are part of your revenue because they are not consistent income. And you cannot take credit for the amount of loans you're able to collect to carry out expenditure. So we carefully took out loans for those states. So for the Index B, we tried to see how states are able to meet their operating expenses and their loan repayment obligations with the total revenue. Then for Index C, it's also a mini composite index, which is our debt sustainability index. Now, last year, we basically just looked at how states would theoretically pay off their debts with what they're able to raise as total revenue for a year. But we expanded that this year, after due consultation with the World Bank, the DMO. And so we now had 4 mini indexes. First, we looked at the debt to GDP ratio of the states, the debt to revenue ratio, the debt service to revenue ratio, and the personnel cost to revenue. Now, all of these particular indexes have thresholds. And so we try to benchmark the states against those thresholds. And we now had one composite index for Index C. For the last index, we try to see how states are prioritizing capital expenditure over operating expenses, especially if you situate that within the fact that there's huge infrastructure deficits and there's a need for states to invest heavily in road infrastructure, the soft infrastructure, as the case may be, to be able to, grow the economy and, improve the development trajectory of the state.
Let me follow up that. Of course, there have been controversies around the source of data putting together this state of state report. So again, I would say how you consulted the states, like you said, but you tell us more about that. Now, how did you source the data for this report?
So there are different components of data that we used. For the fiscals, so for things around gross FAC, IGR, the expenditure and all of our revenue expenditure, we picked it from the audited financial statements of the states, which was published earlier this year.
Okay.
Now, hitherto, we used to rely on the data released by the NBS, that's the Nigeria Bureau of Statistics. But the feedback we got from the states was that what was the essence of releasing the audited financial statements if we would not use the data from those statements? And so this year, we decided to rely on the data from the audit reports. But I mean, shockingly to us, a lot of the states decided, to now still rely on data from the NBS. Now, if you juxtapose the NBS data with the data from the states, you will say that there's a huge variance. I'll give you an example. For instance, for gross FAC, for a state like Bayelsa, there was about a 55 billion naira variance between what MBS published as their gross fact and what the states published. If you come to IGR, which has been the bone of contention, you would see that for a state like Ebonyi, they had published that the IGR was about 26 billion, but what the MBS published was 13 billion. This same Bayelsa, that's in the eye of the storm also. They had published in their reports that their independent revenue, or the IGR, was about 18 billion, but the NBS published 13 billion for the state. Now, where the major bone of contention for IGR, and that was after due consultation with the state, was that Bayelsa wants us to consider the 13% derivation as part of the IGR.
Okay.
Right? And so they say this is revenue that would have been earned hitherto by the states if the mining of oil and gas wasn't under the exclusive preserve of the federal government.
Yeah.
But by nomenclature, components of the IGR, are usually not federal transfers. And so at this point, I don't think we have enough evidence to be able to include that. Now, for some other reasons for the disparity in some of these claims is that if you pick the audit reports of the states, for instance, there are several tables. You would see the cash flow table, you would see the statements of consolidated finances for the states or financial position, as the case may be. But we decided to rely on the cash flow statements for all of the states. Now, for Kogi State, that also put out a report. If you look at their cash flow statement, you would see that what was reported for tax revenue was different from what was in the consolidated financial statement. And so, since we are relying solely on the cash flow statement, because that's what gives us uniformity across board, for the different states, that was probably what was responsible for that disparity. And we had put it out there. We had sent the data to the states to validate. After we gave them 2 weeks to give us feedback. After that, we had sent an invitation to a virtual meeting to the 36 finance commissioners for the states. And we had about 13 attend that meeting. But a number of the states, the bulk number of the states, obviously, neither responded to what we had put out for them to give feedback and the meeting. And so, we need to better harmonize the data. If you even pick two primary sources, the MBS data and the data in the audited financial statements of the states, you will still see those sort of disparities. So there's greater need for harmonization. Yeah. And this is not just happening with IGR or FACT data, as the case may be. If you look at payment to government data, right, you would often get in the oil and gas industry. Sometimes what the DPR publishes is different from what the oil company publishes and all of that. So there's need for efforts to better harmonize the data so that it's more authentic. We do our assessment with the data available. We don't create the data. We don't manufacture the data. We use the data available in the audit reports and some contiguous reports as the case may be.
Interesting stuff. Now, what are some reforms that you would say or that you think that states have undertaken in recent times?
Interestingly, and occasioned by the SIFTA's World Bank program, that's the State Fiscal Transparency, Accountability, and Sustainability Program for Results. In 2018, a lot of states, and up till now, I think the program would round up by the end of this year, a lot of states were incentivized to carry out governance reforms. So before 2018, it used to be very difficult for us to get access to budget data, budget implementation reports. But as of today, for the 36 states of the Federation, you can go to their website, you would see their approved budgets, budget implementation reports, audited financial statements, and even more recently, the audited financial statements for the local government. For the audit law, at the federal, the states have been able to even do better than the federal government. A lot of the states have enacted audit laws that sort of grant operational and financial autonomy to the auditor generals of the states and the local government. And this sort of would improve transparency and accountability at that level. At the federal government level, as you know, we still have a lot of issues with the audits. Till date, the audit report for the 500 billion naira COVID intervention fund has not been released. And we have gone quiet, right? Nobody knows how that fund was utilized. But at the state level or the subnational level, we see that there's increased efforts by the states to be more transparent, more accountable. However, the utilization of this data is still very, very, very low because I know a lot of actors, still do not know how to access this data. On payroll fraud, a lot of the states have been able to capture the biometric and deviant data of, ghost workers, of civil servants and pensioners, and link that to their payroll. And for last year alone, in the annual performance reports for the states, we saw that cumulatively about over 15,000 ghost workers were eliminated from the system as a result of this sort of reform, leading to huge savings for at least 13 states. And so states are beginning to increasingly sort of make efforts to ensure that they improve their governance processes, as the case may be.
Well, it's really interesting, but I would like to wrap up this way that what can these states do? We talk many times about the subnationals and what they can do to support government and stop going to Abuja every month for the, like we said, NNPC has refused to put a dime into the FAC for months now. But what can be done for them to remain, fiscally sustainable?
Very importantly, a lot of these reforms I have mentioned need to be sustained because a lot of them were occasioned or incentivized by, those grants by the World Bank.
Yeah.
And as the program is rounding up, we expect that the gains made from those from that particular program is sustained. On TSA, that's the Treasury Single Account, a lot of the states are yet to either establish or fully operationalize their Treasury Single Account, leading to massive leakages, right? There are some states that still have as many as 50 accounts, and so they do not have full visibility of their state finances. As a matter of fact, some states can double their revenues, by, setting up their Treasury Single Account and making it fully functional. On tax, our tax to GDP ratio at the subnational level is still very low. Cumulatively, it's less than 1%.
Very low.
So I would urge a lot of the states to pick the Kaduna playbook, digitize tax, take out a lot of them, because a lot of revenues are lost to non-state actors. Nigerians are paying a lot of taxes, but it's not getting to the government. Yeah. It's lost in the middle. Yeah. So we need to digitize the tax collection system to take out a lot of the middlemen and, sort of begin to tax high net worth individuals. Because if you look at it, the high net worth individuals who are supposed to be paying more are practically paying less because there's no systematic way of, sort of collecting taxes from these persons. Lastly, states need to improve the ease of doing business. If you look at the data on capital importation between 2019 and 2021, at least 10 states received no capital importation, that's foreign direct investment, in those 3 years. Lagos State alone was responsible for over 99% of the capital importation that came to subnationals. So states need to begin to address issues like double taxation. They need to begin to improve their export potentials. Then for things that are a little bit beyond their control, security, electricity, they need to work better with the federal government to ensure that infrastructure around electricity, improving digital access needs to, be further improved so that, the capacity of these states to attract investment, both domestic and local, will be enhanced, and they can generate enough revenues, to spend on critical programs.
Interesting and, of course, educating conversation there. I've been speaking to Mr. Iniobong Usen. He is the head research and policy advisory at BudgIT. Thank you so much for clearing all of this and making us understand this document better. But when there are further questions, we'll definitely reach out. Hope you'll be available to talk to us.
Thanks for having me. I'm always available.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. I appreciate this.